Hey internets, so there's actually a lot of communist memes out there if you're willing to look for them. And a lot of them tend to be bad, and I mean really, really bad. Many of them are just often copies of rightoid memes that have been subverted, and others are just plain boring, uninspired, giving off this kind of how do you do fellow kids energy. But the more interesting ones are the ones that, to the average person, may just not make any sense at all. You see it, you can tell that it's a meme, but it just kind of eludes you what the heck they're talking about. Now, I've studied both communist economics and non-communist economics. And so in this video, I'm going to help you decipher some of the more obscure communist memes and help you understand just kind of the bizarre copes and weird dog whistles that go into these. Let's start with this meme, the free market and then the really, really free market. With the really free market guy saying, no, really, everything is free, take what you want, friends. And then the free market doge, depicted as the crying doge, says, I depend on state violence to procure compliant wage laborers. Oh boy, but what's interesting here is that there's a lot of layers to this nonsense that the average person might not necessarily pick up on. But there's one thing that it shows immediately, which is that communists are kind of logic blind. One of the things I've been noticing more and more, especially when studying some more obscure leftist theory. For instance, I was reading through Farrell Dobbs recently on revolutionary continuity, and spoiler alert, just to keep things really short and simple, it's pretty stupid. And that's really what this meme does. It just kind of completely ignores the concept of incentives. If you just try to make everything free, then there's nothing really to stop an outsider from just taking it. It's kind of the problem with the honor system. It doesn't scale very well. For example, imagine if you have a town and they all agree that all of the money that they get, they're just gonna keep that money in the center of the town. And whenever anybody needs anything, they can just go and take what they need. And the problem with this is that the number of dishonest people you need in your town in order for this system to not work is 1. You see, the problem with communists is that they think that they can somehow extend a way of thinking that works for the family to all of society. So it's a very, very naive way of thinking. But what's more important is that when you understand economic theory on the macro level, you realize that the doge on the left here actually isn't a free market. Because if someone doesn't want to give their stuff away for free, how do you make everything free? Well, the answer is you'd have to force them, and that's called theft. Which then just immediately reveals just how silly the straw man on the right is. So the actual free market, the one that depends on voluntary exchanges, depends on state violence. Okay, this just immediately brings up the question, does it count as an action of the state if a shop owner defends his own goods from theft? If people are trying to rob him and he pulls out a shotgun, is he the state now? Logical conclusions of this from a philosophical perspective are just completely ridiculous. It's effectively implying that authoritarianism is when you defend yourself from theft. It's fascinating, really. The more you analyze this meme, the stupider it reveals itself to be. But what's disgusting is that communists will often make things like this simply as a way so that they can equivocate later during debates. I have unironically seen communists equivocate during debates claiming that they want to have a free market. Of course, they're lying because when they say free market, they actually mean this nonsense. But that doesn't matter. So long as they can equivocate based on a completely illogical argument, they can try to get away with it. Which is weird because the Doge meme specifically can be a very good meme even when it has no politicization attached to it. In fact, just for the heck of it, I'm going to have my own example of that meme where it's literally just the Doge meme on sale on my merch store, back by popular demand. So if you want to support me and get something cool in return, you can either get the Doge Wave meme as a shirt or as a nice mug. And I'll keep those on sale for about a week or two. But anyways, let's move on to a meme that shows even more interesting things that are going on in the communist mentality. Behold the victims of communism. And of course, it's a bunch of leaders of some various fascist regimes during the mid-1900s. Now, aside from this just being somewhat historically inaccurate, it's important to understand that there's actually a very big cope baked into this. You see, a lot of commies, especially the young teenage commies, they often like being communist to make their entire identity be anti-fascist. It's kind of their way of always wanting to be seen as the good guys trademark. However, there's a problem with this from a historical perspective, which is that when you really study the regime of the Soviet Union over Joseph Stalin, and of course Nazi Germany, you find out that they're actually very similar to each other. There's mountains of evidence showing their similarity. Both were extremely oppressive authoritarian regimes, where the state heavily interfered with the voluntary exchange of goods and services. And there's an extremely long video from Tick History out there on this, but a simpler way to understand it, if you just read Hans Hermann Hoppe on a theory of socialism and capitalism, you'll come to understand that pretty much all economies are really just mixtures of capitalism and socialism to some degree. And it has to do with how much the state interferes with that voluntary exchange of goods and services. And then when you take that understanding and you look at these mid-1900s regimes again, you'll realize that they're actually very similar. And now this, of course, creates an identity crisis for the commies. They can't accept the fact that their entire self-identity is based on a lie. They don't want to accept the fact that communism and fascism are very close to each other on on the economic freedom scale, and to what degree the state ends up interfering with people's daily lives. And so one of their go-to copes of this is to point out the fact that, hey, the Soviet Union fought against Nazi Germany in World War II, with their logic being that because they fought against each other, then they must be very different, which is just from a historical perspective completely nonsense. States with similar systems have fought amongst each other all the time, and it's actually kind of weird. It's almost like they're expecting us to just forget the first few thousand years of human history, where various monarchist republics fought amongst each other all the freaking time. There's actually very little about being similar to each other that prevents nations from fighting. And so when they say, oh well, the Soviet Union fought against Nazi Germany, it's a completely arbitrary argument. It's pure cope. But what's more interesting is when you understand what kind of similarity does prevent nations from fighting amongst each other. And that is when nations actually are more towards the scale of free markets. Nations with higher levels of economic freedom, the nations that interfere the least with, again, the voluntary exchange of goods and services, are less likely to fight amongst each other. This is actually another very interesting pattern we've seen in the last 2 centuries or so. And the reason why this happens is actually fairly obvious when you think about it from the perspective of incentives, you know, that wonderful concept that communists like to again ignore, which in reality is very straightforward. When you have 2 nations that are more towards the scale of being an open and free market, they both reach a point where when they want to get something from each other, it becomes less expensive to simply trade that something with each other than it does to engage in a costly war to get what they want. That's really it. It just comes down to economic incentive. Going to war with a nation costs more than free trade with that nation. There's no need for a bigger nation to expand their empire and risk the loss of money and the loss of life of their citizens when the other nation is willing to accept less payment for basically the same benefit. And so they just have no need for war at that point. Or to put it simply, as you move more and more towards capitalism or a free market, you also just create more of a natural incentive towards peaceful resolutions. And so now going back to this whole, oh, well, the Soviets fought the Nazis, the cope fully reveals itself, because 2 authoritarian regimes fighting each other is actually expected product behavior. In truth, the only real difference back then between fascism and communism, at least in terms of comparing the ideology of the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, was that Hitler's socialism was more on the lines of ethnic class, whereas Joseph Stalin was more closely following Marx's class theory, which was based more on economic class, which was specifically based on who owns the means of production or not. Which is very interesting considering the next meme we're gonna go over, which is this one right here. White male shoots up elementary school, thoughts and prayers. Someone harms a Tesla, domestic terrorism. And of course it's a flower wearing a MAGA hat in order to signify the typical conservative. Now, before really getting into this meme and what it means, it shows something interesting, which is that it's based a little bit on ethnic class. And that's just what's so funny about how today's communists like to make their entire identity about being anti-fascist. Because of course, modern neo-Marxist strains of communism in the post-2000s is actually closer to being between fascism and communism, in that it puts a focus on ethnic class identity and ethnic collective guilt, and integrates it as an additional component of Marxist ideology. The only real difference is now they're blaming the whites instead of blaming everything on the Jews. So that's just kind of a funny thing to think about, but what's really interesting here is just the kind of false comparison fallacy, and how communists are, again, just kind of logic blind when it comes to the concept of incentives. Back when far lefties were burning people's Teslas, what made that an act of domestic terrorism was that they were trying to say, hey, if you buy these products from this guy that we hate, we're going to destroy it and you will have wasted your money. And that's, well, what domestic terrorism is. It's an attempt to use violence in order to instill fear into a population in order to get that population to do what you want. And so vandalizing Teslas as a political statement was just a way of getting people less likely to buy them out of fear that their car could be targeted. And then school shootings, well, some of them are also domestic terrorism. Occasionally a school shooter will publish some deranged manifesto, but the problem is a lot of times those manifestos don't really have the same kick behind them as a more scaled operation as mass vandalism does, because you have more than one participant. When the participant of some deranged school shooting manifesto ends up getting killed during the shooting, well, then the fear component and the incentives that it creates just kind of goes away. Nobody cares. And then of course, a lot of school shootings, there's just no manifesto at all. It's just some deranged teenager or young adult who is just taking out their anger on innocent people. That's what makes this such a stupid meme. The implication it's trying to make just doesn't really hold up. And it also just kind of implies a false accusation here. This accusation that the right doesn't want to do anything about school shootings, or that the right somehow enjoys the school shootings. Accusations which are just completely and obviously false. So it's also a very bad meme in that regard. It kind of lacks that humorous punch because what it's implying doesn't actually make any sense. And faulty comparisons are actually kind of a feature of communist memes rather than a bug. They're very, very common. Like for example, this meme, which interestingly enough is another example of ethno-collectivism, but that's not what's important here. Stating, never forget that the Black Panthers group formed to protect black people from the KKK was dismantled by US government, but the KKK exists today. Now, this right here is an example of just pure communist lying and propaganda. First off, the meme conveniently leaves out the fact that it's talking specifically about the Black Panther Party, which was an actual Marxist-Leninist political party in the United States founded back in the 1960s. So already it's comparing apples to oranges, because we're comparing the state regulating itself with a more private-oriented organization. To understand why this is a bad comparison, though, you kind of have to understand that the Black Panther Party can be compared somewhat to the current modern-day South African Party or the Economic Freedom Fighters. They held relatively similar views to that, and so the EFF gives us a better idea of what the Black Panthers would have turned into. To make a long story short, the whole claim here that the Black Panther group was formed to protect black people from the KKK is entirely dishonest. Marxist-Leninist takes on ethnic class ultimately is a precursor to class warfare. They were not solving a racial problem, but rather they were racial agitators, intentionally making the problems worse, while falsely claiming to do the opposite. Also, the claim that they've been dismantled, but the KKK exists today, that's also kind of a half-truth. Yes, the KKK still exists today, but they're virtually powerless, and let's be honest, they're a laughingstock. And on the flip side, while the Black Panther Party, the actual political group, yeah, sure, they're gone, but there's plenty of private groups that exist today that preach similar philosophy. One of them, again, just being modern neo-Marxism. But mainly this kind of meme just shows how communists like to pretend to be the good guys in terms of racial relations. They like to pretend like they're going to resolve or fix or get rid of racism, when in reality, intentional agitation of ethnic issues is just one of their tricks to get what they want. In fact, a lot of communist memes, rather than being designed to be funny, are more or less just designed to take advantage of people's emotions and appeal to moralistic arguments in order to shut down critical thinking. Like this one right here, the life of a single human being is worth 1,000,000 times more than all of the property of the richest man on earth. Che. Now, this little quote right here, rather than being a meme, is just really good moralistic propaganda. Because in a sense, in a very pedantic way, it's kind of true. If you ever found yourself in a situation where pressing one button results in the richest man losing the titles to all of his mansions, and pressing the other button results in a random person dying, well, both buttons are evil, but generally physical property is worth less than the life of another. The problem, of course, is that this is a false dichotomy, and it's trying to trick you into transferring that false dichotomy into communist thinking. In reality land, adopting the ideology of stealing property from the rich is actually a very stupid thing to do because it again kills incentives. Again, communists are logic blind when it comes to incentives. What that actually does in practice is it just destroys economic growth, which interestingly enough, lower economic growth results in more poor people dying. Because what this propaganda is trying to trick you into not noticing is that communism doesn't actually resolve scarcity in any way. Their ideology, pushed to its logical conclusion, does the exact opposite of what this image is claiming. And ultimately, it also shows us that a lot of communist memes, when you peel back the nonsense, well, they reveal themselves to be little more than just attempts to justify violence and theft. And so let's go over one last meme that really showcases this. Know the work rules, and we have Luigi Mangione here saying that he killed a CEO. It is deemed as appropriate, with the woman saying, "Ah, you're sweet." And then Joseph Stalin saying the same thing, but he killed a lot of CEOs. Hello, human resources. Now, aside from just trying to justify violence, the real point of this meme is to take those philosophically illiterate left-leaning liberals and try to push them further to the left. It's communists saying, hey, if you're a liberal and you sympathize with Luigi Mangione, then you're a hypocrite if you don't also support Joseph Stalin. And here's the funny thing, on a pedantic level, they're correct. Their ideology, of course, isn't correct here. Murdering people in cold blood is absolutely not a good thing, but it is correct in the sense that liberal leftists who think this way, if they were to take their thoughts and their beliefs to their logical conclusions, then yes, they would become Marxists. Now, of course, that's not the correct conclusion they should come to. The correct conclusion would be them realizing that liberty and the free exchange of goods and services is actually incompatible with any kind of leftist ideology. But that doesn't really matter, because the thing about good communist propaganda is that a lot of it can be understood as coming in two different waves. The first wave is to try and trick people into thinking that right-wing ideology is evil, or in other words, if you're a rightoid in any way, shape, or form, then you're literally bad mustache man. And then the other part of their propaganda is to try and give the liberals a false choice between themselves and, again, literally bad mustache man. And so the strategy of the propaganda behind this meme is to try and take your typical brainwashed neolib, sort of soc-just lefty type who sympathizes with Luigi, and to put them in a choice between either taking what they believe and pushing it to its logical conclusions and becoming a tanky, or to accept that they're wrong. And since people don't like accepting accepting that they're wrong. The target is thus successfully brainwashed into adopting neo-Marxist ideology. And that's another reason why so many far-left memes are so bad. They're not really intended to be funny. They're just intended to brainwash a very specific target. And so their goals are often just indoctrination mixed with virtue signaling. And so hopefully you now understand why so many of them at the surface don't really seem to make any sense or seem to be just words. They are neither grounded in truth, nor are they intended to be. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and if you like my content and you want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or again by buying some merch, and I am putting the Dogewave merch on a temporary sale. So yeah, that is all. Till next time.